Welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja. And today, in the final video on my series on Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, I'll be talking about the fourth and final section of the book. Now, I've called it the Dilsey Gibson section, but this is the only section of the novel that is narrated in a third-person narration. No, the previous three sections were all narrated in the first person. So the Benji section, we are in Benji's mind, right? Jason's section, we are in Jason's mind. The Quentin section, we are in Quentin's mind. But this particular section is in a third person voice. Now, first of all, there are advantages to a third person narrative voice. You can obviously see that from the very start of this section. And one of the advantages is that we get more external descriptions of the characters and the space. So instead of being within the interiority of the first person narrator, we are looking at the world from this detached third person perspective. So the section starts with a description of Dilsey Gibson. Until now, we don't know how she looks like, right? Then there is a description of the house. Then we get an external description of Benji. So these are the advantages of the third person narrator or narration that we can pinpoint as soon as we start reading this section. In terms of plot, what happens in this section? So in this section, we learn how Dilsey's day begins by starting the fire, making breakfast. We also learn how she handles the figure of the mother, Mrs. Compson, how she deals with Jason, how she deals or thinks about lovingly about Miss Quentin, right? How she's protective of her. And then her treatment of Luster. He's the only one of the grandchildren, I think he's a grandchild of hers, who appears in this section, even though there are references to Teepee. So we kind of understand that she is a central figure in this household, and it comes through in this section. Another important thing in this section is, of course, we learn part of Jason's quest, right? By this time, Miss Quentin has run away. Jason is trying to follow her, right? He assumes that she is going to be where the show, the person with red necktie who supposedly from the show that was in town, that she has escaped with him. So he follows, he drives all the way to the place where the show is next being held. He has an encounter with a person in a trailer, almost gets in a fight, and then he's escorted out of there by the show manager. And the show manager tells him, look, they are no longer here. So obviously they are gone, Miss Quentin and her male friend. So Jason then in defeat returns. But as he's driving up there, Jason has these thoughts. He thinks of himself on this quest. He thinks of himself as this warrior figure. But he's more worried about two things. He's mad at the sheriff for not helping him. And he's really mad because a woman, Miss Quentin, has robbed him. And so that gives you some peculiar information about his sexism and his other delusional aspects of his character. Now, an important thing to keep in mind in this entire experience is the amount of money that he had stolen from Miss Quentin is $3,000. That's what she has run away with. So by the end of his quest, he is returning back. He has paid someone $4 to drive him back because he has a headache. Another important aspect or event in this section is Dilsey Gibson, along with Benji and other Black people of the town, visiting the Sunday service of a Black church. And that's really wonderfully described as people are walking to the church and then the experience of the church itself. They have a visiting pastor, and everyone has been talking about it, that he's a powerful orator and speaker. But when they see him, he's this frail old man, and they're like, well, this guy doesn't look like the preacher people were talking about. And so the preacher first gives a normal sermon, what they consider the white people's speech. And then he switches into a more charismatic sermon, right, in the dialect that the people speak. And that's where you get the power of the performative aspect of a black church, right, where the audience participates in the process of the sermon. And I think that's wonderfully done. And it could give us, from a third person perspective, the spiritual lives of former slaves who are still, trapped in the same lives, working for the same former families. And we also know in this section that this family is at its end. Dilsey says a number of times, I have seen it, I had seen it in the beginning, and I'm seeing it at the end, something to like that. So we know that the family is ending. There was one other point in this section that kept baffling me as I was reading it, and that was Luster constantly keeps going into the basement, and Dilsey constantly keeps asking him, what are you doing in the basement? And I couldn't figure it out until finally I focused on his actions. So we see him with a handsaw, then we see him crafting a tool, but he says, I still can't do it. I need to find something to hit it with. And finally, I connected with his experience of going to the show. And one of the main events at the show was that a guy could actually play a handsaw like a musical instrument. And it struck me, oh, that is what he is trying to do. He has found the saw, and he's trying to figure out how to play it like the guy in the show. By the way, I asked this question in a quiz of my students. I actually gave them the page number and Luster's quote, but they all had trouble actually understanding or giving a correct answer, because the answer has to be found out by a careful reading of all the parts of the novel and not just part 4. So by the end of part 4, Benji, is troubled. He's crying. So Dilsey asks Luster to take him out on the carriage. The carriage is almost lopsided, and the horse, Queenie, is also old, and Luster has never driven a carriage before, but he's like, I can do it. So he takes Benji to the town. He's supposed to take him to the graveyard, but he takes a wrong turn and wants to take him around the town square. And Benji starts crying, of course, because that breaks his routine, right? And that's when we see Jason come and push Luster aside. I think he even hits him, and he tells him, take him back. Okay, take him back home. And the novel ends at they driving back home. And here's the last line. The broken flower drooped over Ben's fist, and his eyes were empty and blue and serene again as cornice and facade flowed smoothly once more from left to right, post and tree, window and doorway and signboard, each in its ordered place. So the last lines of the novel kind of suggest that everything is in order, visually speaking. And that teaches us that by taking a wrong turn, what Luster had done was disturbed the way Benji views the scene as he's riding the carriage. And if you have taken care of anyone with special needs or know about someone, having things in an ordered form is crucial for their happiness, right? If you disturb something, they don't understand it and it distresses them. So in a way, then the novel ends where Luster is driving Benji back on a familiar path. And that's where the novel ends. It's an inconclusive ending, but that's how most modernist novels are, right? So overall, if we look at all the 4 sections, we learned about Benji's life and how he sees the world in section 1. Then we learned about Quentin, the time period of Quentin's section in 1910, right? And one day in Benji's life, one day in Quentin's life, until we figure out or construe that Quentin commits suicide on that day. And then we have Jason's section, one day in his life. And the final section in a third-person narration is mostly one day in Dilsey Gibson's life. But this is the section where we also get more information about the mother, more information about Benji's appearance, the house appearance, and other experiences of the church that we had not seen in the previous sections. So that's roughly my understanding of part 4 of The Sound and the Fury. If you decide to teach this novel or read this novel, I would highly recommend reading it carefully, diligently, taking notes, pointing to yourself, where you are at a given narrative. And if you look at my notes, I mean, this book has kind of a mapping of where I am. You see, like I give myself these notes and point to myself where I am, how is this section connected to the others. But it will require, like any modernist novel, a careful and diligent reading. That's all. Thank you so much. Please let me know what you think of this series. And if you take a look at the playlist that comes up in a few seconds, there are a lot of other discussions on other novels as well. So please feel free to watch them. Thank you so much. Stay safe, be kind, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.